haven't hooked up my soundboard yet. You hear me better now? Yeah, I haven't hooked up my soundboard yet. So, I can't do that kind of slide thing, and I can't even figure out, as I kind of look through the directions of my soundboard, like this like kind of mini thing. It's got 2 tracks, so I guess I could play this on 1 track. I'm not an audio engineer yet, but I'd like to get there, so we'll see what happens. But today's show, and it is Friday, February 24th, so I'm not out, doing anything good. I'm just kind of being a at-home schlub, doing my show, which I do every day, I hope, or I try to. And some things have been kind of coming together lately regarding some of my racial views. I hate to say that because, the R word usually turns into some sort of you're a racist thing. And I'm hoping that people will kind of listen to this before they make that conclusion. If you think I'm a racist from your point of view, that's all good for you. But I think if you listen to it, you won't really think that. You'd have to be kind of abnormal. Because what I'm going to go into as far as it is kind of the opposite. It's actually kind of liberal. Or it ends up in a liberal view. Now, a couple days ago, as many of you know, I'm talking like I have listeners, right? I think I have like 1 or 2 people that listen to this. As I've stated before, I have, some disabilities. One is I got injured at work, and it was a spinal injury, and now I have a degenerative disc disease. So, it seems like the rest of my spine is kind of, either, they got tears in the discs, and, all the discs are kind of shrinking and drying out. As I see here, smoking on puffing on a cigarette, they say that that's actually one of the worst things you could do, by the way. So be stronger than me. Don't smoke. So we have that. And I was basically born in a panic attack, so I've always had kind of problems with anxiety and depression that kind of running on both sides of my family. Too bad opposites don't attract. It would have been nice if I had like a psychologically healthy parent to kind of offset the psychologically unhealthy one. But no, like attracts is the reality. And so I got one side had anxiety, the other side had depression, and I got the double whammy. Oh, and my father's side also had ADHD, so more like a triple whammy. But I'm talking about something a little different. I want to go into race and genes and all that stuff. And I kind of started putting this together a long time ago. It was basically just the whole out of Africa theory got me thinking about a few things. But I went, because I'm disabled, I went to kind of get some help from the county down here in Broward County. And I met this woman who was absolutely like disgustingly gorgeous. And she was of African descent, but she had her features weren't necessarily that African, if that makes sense. And it gave me kind of a regurgitation of a thought I already had, that the out of Africa theory says that we hit a bottleneck in East Africa. And we actually even have a town that represents this. That's basically our origin point. There are people still living there. And this town has the highest genetic variability of any area in the world. And that's how we kind of back up the out of Africa theory, because that would be the people who are the progeny of our original race back when it was only 10,000 people. It almost went extinct. We were awfully close. So whether our race started in Africa or not, we had a bottleneck at some point where we only had these 10,000 people. So as I'm looking at this woman who's one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen, kind of thin, like the biggest rack I've ever seen on such a thin woman. Um, just very, like, sexually appetizing in my view. While I'm looking at this woman, I'm thinking of all the genes. Something in my head said, like, all the genes are in Africans. Like, it just kind of reiterated a thought I've had before. All these, what became the other races, as we say kind of colloquially, it's become an outdated concept, though. Um, we could kind of call them gene poolings, especially if they were isolated for a while from intermingling with the other gene pools around them, for mountain ranges or deserts between them and the rest of civilization. There's all sorts of reasons for those gene poolings, and there is also the theory that there were other hominids around that certain groups interbred with and the rest of humanity didn't. So they might look a little bit different, might even have a little bit different of a brain, but there would never be enough intermingling to make them any sort of different species, right? So we've kind of chopped ourselves up into races, and it seems a bit ridiculous to me because all that variability is in this one area of East Africa still to this day. You go there and they have like the shortest people, the tallest people, the most intelligent, the least intelligent, the bluest eyes, the brownest eyes, like all the things that are inherent in the spread of genetics that we have are represented in this one area. So that becomes kind of our starting point. Like I said, even if the out of Africa theory is wrong, we had this bottleneck. So it's makes kind of the out of Africa theory kind of right no matter what. So we're based on this group of 10,000 people. Adam and Eve were actually, about 5,000 of them each, let's say. And I find it very interesting because we often talk about Africans as one of the races, but that doesn't make sense because if you look at the whole of Africa, they represent all the genetic variability in our race. So they can't be a separate race from any of the other races because they represent all of the variability that you could possibly have, especially in this one area. So that, like, African being a race just doesn't make any kind of scientific sense, right? The only race they could be is the human race because that's where that bottleneck was. So you only have a human race. One of the other things that set me off was inbreeding. I'll get to that later. That's actually one of the things that every subgroup has in common. Do not freaking inbreed or you're going to basically kill your group. I'll go into that later and why that came up. But the main point is we can't really see Africans as a race because that's almost redundant to say they're a human race. No, they're just a human. As far as, they would be representative of the human race in this one area. I mean, you could only kind of pick and choose groups in Africa and say, okay, they're all very dark skinned, they have like a wide nose, blah, blah, blah. And then you could say that's another like subgroup. Because what happens is people, and this is more my own theory, the first part, but there's more parts to it. The first part is, let's say you have this group at the origin area. I forget the name of the town, but it's an actual town. I've seen a documentary on it. And you saw all these people, like you would have like people who had kind of Asian, African, but with like, natural blonde hair, like all these weird mixes you don't see anywhere else. And I can kind of combine that with other things I've seen and other theories I've heard and other articles. and I came up with this different way of thinking of race. Like I said, okay, you could say somebody from a certain area that's maybe been isolated, and they show more of one part of the variability. You could say they're you could say colloquially they might be like another race or another people, another group. But if in Africa, you have all the Asian genes, you have all the Caucasian genes, you have all the whatever subgroup we're dividing ourselves into today, then there really isn't any race other than the African humans. And there are sub groups that are skewed for whatever reason towards one part. And okay, that theory I was talking about that I kind of came up with, I call it the Mets hat theory. It's kind of like if you go to Queens in New York or in Brooklyn, you'll see people with Mets hats. They're kind of divided between Mets and Yankees fans, right? But when you see like a Mets hat or Yankee hat, depending on, what team you're into, you might think, oh, those are one of my people, they're a Mets fan, right? So what if during this early bottleneck, for whatever reason, maybe one group was much better at swimming, their hands were slightly webbed, or they didn't sink as easily because they had, a different type of body fat. Who knows? There are all sorts of differences within our gene pool of humans. So for whatever reason, a group might move on and say, you know what, we're both Mets fans, we both have the Mets hat. Of course, in evolution, we're talking about some sort of genetic difference, and they kind of, maybe they kind of get together, and they, at some point, kind of tribe off, but they're still living near the original tribe, or the original tribes, but they decide, let's move on. We need better hunting grounds, because one of the theories out of Africa theory is that it was like this lush kind of forest land, and it turned into savanna, so there wasn't as much food, etc., so it couldn't support that many people. So what's the first natural grouping you're going to have? You're going to have these kind of external cues, like the Mets hat, but maybe, slightly bluer eyes. So you get this group with slightly bluer eyes kind of getting together and seeing themselves as the Mets hat people, and then they group off, and they take most of the slightly bluer-eyed people with them, and they go somewhere else, and then, maybe they go more to northern Africa, northeastern Africa, and, and as they're kind of inbreeding with these slightly bluer eyes, you get people who get bluer and bluer eyes, and now you got like these kind of like Fremen-looking people. Not that they exist. That's actually not in our genetic variability. But if, let's say it was, then maybe they move on and go, yeah, we're the really blue-eyed people. These are the slightly blue-eyed people. Let's, since we're, we all have the same Mets hat, let's go off and join, become our own group, blah, blah, blah. And this kind of naturally happens as groups get bigger and the area doesn't support as many people. Whatever you put in, like you have like limited farming. As the farming develops, you have better hunting techniques. You have, as all these things develop, people are still going to kind of get too crowded, which is why I'm not a big fan of cities, because they're kind of like an overcrowding. That's beyond what our race likes to have. So we kind of branch off, and I see like you think of it as like these little like interconnected circles, all right? Or maybe like a flattened out molecule where you have these kind of roads to the next circle and another circle, and that kind of spreads out, and then and it becomes kind of exponential, and we grow that way. But it would have been growing from this bottleneck, which I can't emphasize enough is so important to this theory. And, no matter how proven something is, it's always a theory. That's kind of another point that needs to be made a lot, because you have to have that humility that or you're going to start basing things on a scientific precept that may or may not be true, and you kind of can go off in some really bad directions, kind of like the Nazis did. So I want to keep mentioning that to, encourage people not to become Nazis. Encourage anybody who ever listens to this. Wetting my whistle. I talk a lot and I get dry a lot because of that. So, for whatever reasons, and there is some evidence that there was kind of some interbreeding with certain European groups, or what would later become like, the European groups and the Neanderthals. So there is some, genetic variance that's a little bit outside of the species, where we might have a little bit more of a difference than we'd normally have. But what I can't see in these this kind of short evolutionary time period is us mutating too much. Like, let's say you have a species that's sitting in this one area, and we have this natural selection thing handed down from Darwin. That was his big thing, was natural selection. A lot of the other evolutionary theories were actually already there. It was just a mechanism that he came up with, and he had somebody else came up with it at the same time. So we don't know who stole it from who. But anyway, let's say you're in one area. You're a group that's kind of limited, and you can just live in this one area. And over time, there will be mutations that will make you more and more fit for that one area. That takes a long time. That takes a lot of generations. So the whole thought of us, these are just mutations. As we kind of went into Asia and Europe and crossed the land bridge into the Americas, that these are all mutations. Well, one, if you go to this area in Africa, all the genetic variability available to the human race is in that area. So there goes that theory. Two, it's just not, in biological evolutionary time, there's just not enough time to put in that many mutations that would cause the variability we see. But we don't even need that, because, like I said, there are people who are left behind or stayed for whatever reason, and in this area of Africa, they're as genetically variable as you can get. The shortest, tallest, smartest, dumbest, everything you could possibly think of. Bluest, brownest eyes, largest assholes, smallest assholes. All of that is kind of contained within this area of Africa. And considering we came from 10,000 people and there was probably very little influence from the other hominids, we are one tight-ass knit family. And we see that in another thing, and that's interbreeding. We're already kind of tight-knit as far as our genetic variance. So we have these subspecies we have, which we call races, doesn't really make that much sense. It only makes sense kind of externally, eye color, hair type, all that stuff. Yes, that's going to be what we're going to first go to and say, hey, you got the Mets hat, I got the Mets hat, let's, get together or whatever and be a group. But as far as the basic frame, we are very tight-knit. We are very close genetically. And it seems that we really overblow this whole external appearance thing. Because I got to tell you, it was mind-blowing when I saw this documentary of this one area in Africa. And, you have a guy who had European blonde hair. And not just blonde, but that blonde type. It's not like he had African hair that was blonde. He had European blonde hair, but he had Asian eyes and an African nose. He wasn't short we think Asians are, or tall like we think Africans are. He was just my height, 5'9" or something. So it was very, very strange. But looking at that, you go, wow, just one area is everything that we have. And for whatever reason, as we went into these different areas, I talked about sometimes people leave because they're similar and they get together and say, let's go form a new group because, the population gets too much for the area. And, so, the initial thing might be, like I said, some sort of appearance thing that you can see, which is good actually because it retains a lot of the other genetic variables by kind of paying attention to kind of some sort of meaningless variables that aren't really that important. So we spread out that way, and that's probably why we successfully spread and didn't die out, because we were paying attention to his hair's nappy like mine. Let's go east. We'll be a group while we're paying attention to the stupid shit. The important variables were actually just as mixed, probably. So that kind of saved our ass and was that made us spreading out probably a lot easier. So we as groups we go, and then as groups we encounter different environments. Those environments select for different variables, but within the variance that is the original 10,000. Like I said, there's going to be very little genetic influence from like Neanderthals and Homo habilis, Homo erectus, etc. Any of the groups that kind of existed along with us. I'm not sure. I know Neanderthal was. I think Homo erectus was in Asia. So you would have a sort of influence, but it would be very minimal. Because, like I said, you look at this town in Africa, they have everything already. I don't see anything that's any different. But it could be, maybe like a little brain difference or something like that. Or maybe like, genes for a slightly better vision. Stuff that's not too obvious, right? But could be important, maybe. But the bigger thing is the variance is important. That we have to kind of keep that variance. So this is a very strong argument against any kind of genocide, because without that variance, we're screwed. And because we're already so tightly knit, that's why inbreeding becomes such a problem. When people are genetically too close, you get recessive gene disorders, you get a general drop in IQ, you get a general rise in aggressivity. It's almost like a de-evolution. It takes the worst genes from our variants and, kind of showcases it. And if we didn't have these kind of better dominant genes, we'd be in trouble, right? If we didn't have a dominant gene for normal intelligence and normal health and etc., if this stuff wasn't caused by genetic inbreeding, if it was just something that we couldn't get rid of, our race would have been gone already. So it's the variance we have, as wide as it is still very close-knit for a species. And it's mostly, like I said, like things that aren't that important, or the variability just isn't that much compared to like another species. We may think that somebody with a 160 IQ and somebody with a 60 IQ, that's a huge variance. But if you compare it to, let's say, chimpanzees and their IQ, wow, we're much different from chimpanzees in that way. So it's, and they're pretty closely related to us on the evolutionary scale. I think we split off from them. We had by the way, we had a common ancestor. Okay, because I know a lot of people in the religious circles try to misquote science and say that the scientific theory is that we evolved from monkeys or chimpanzees. No, we had kind of a proto-human / chimpanzee, and then we split off, and one branch became them, one branch became us. And that branch probably didn't have the communication skills of either. It was probably simpler than both. Well, evidently simpler than both. So, because we're so tightly knit, inbreeding is it brings up problems pretty quickly. It could just be one generation. It could, to bring out like some sort of recessive gene disorder. One breeding with like a brother and sister, or a guy and his first cousin. But as you get into more than that one generation, you pretty much guaranteed a lot of bad stuff. And I was watching the Joe Rogan show, and they had Gavin McInnes. That's right, the guy from Rebel Media. I find him very entertaining, and people make him out to be much more right wing than he is. I will say he's kind of slap happy, like he wants to punch people, and I don't think that's the greatest method in the world. I'm more of a Joe Rogan kind of peacenik type of guy. But at least he's trying to like get some sort of sense out there. He's an anti-SJW, and the SJWs kind of deserve to have an anti-SJW. But I digress. It's really about what they brought up on the show. Evidently, there was a study in Britain, or like a British company did a study, and it was, it wasn't done in like 1906 or 1920, or I almost said the Russians, by the Nazis or something. It was done recently, and it was saying, going into inbreeding in the Islamic world, and not really more like kind of the Middle Eastern Muslim sects and Muslim areas, as opposed to, there's a whole bunch of other areas where there is Islam. I get the feeling that some of these groups already had kind of an inbreeding thing going on. I don't think it was Muhammad. I don't think he ordered inbreeding. There's nothing I remember from the history of Islam or the Quran, from the little snippets I've seen of it, that said, hey, you got to marry your first cousin. That wasn't a thing, as far as I can tell. Maybe I'm wrong. Some of you Muslim scholars out there could, tell me if I'm wrong. I'd rather know that I'm wrong than, think that I'm right. So they put up this study, and I think it was PJ Media had put up the study, but Jamie from the Joe Rogan show actually went around and he found a bunch of websites that had quoted the same study. I don't think he ever got back to the actual, whatever Institute of Health did it or whatever, because it was just kind of quoted by these right-wing kind of websites. So, I have my doubts about its validity if it's only on the right-wing sites. They could be regurgitating their own kind of propaganda. Or, on the other hand, they could just be kind of the only people that will talk about this study because they're the only people that don't care if someone calls them racist. Hopefully you're not coming to that conclusion for me, but hey, it happens. So the inbreeding thing that's going on in this kind of like snippet of the Muslim world, kind of, it's like explaining ISIS right there, except in one way. Yes, lower IQs, higher aggressivity. But how are they even like kind of setting up a government, setting up a military? I mean, you would think if, you kind of have a low IQ, highly aggressive people, they're not going to be capable of that. So it seems to me that if that is true, then they would have to have some sort of external help. People who are giving them the weapons. They're not really procuring them for themselves. They're just kind of, dropping on their lap. So I found that kind of weird. If out of one side of our mouth we're saying they're way too simple to do this, and at the other side we're saying, look how evil they are, they're doing this. Kind of self-contradictory. But like I said, it could be groups helping them. There is the theory that like ISIS was started really by us, the U.S., to create a boogeyman. There's all sorts of theories. And I don't really know. But I know I don't know. So we have this kind of a situation where I wonder what we would do if it was true. I'm just asking the question here. Like I said, I don't know about the validity of this study. If it's a real study, a made-up study. I think we all kind of realize that inbreeding does end up badly because it creates the possibility of the recessive gene disorders. So I don't think any of us are going to disagree with that. I just don't know if in the Muslim world, even in the Middle East, if there's this kind of inbreeding going on or why it would happen. I don't think it's inherent to Islam, but it might be inherent to those cultures that were pre-existing. Remember, these were conquered cultures. Where did Islam start? Was it Mecca or Medina? There's some back and forth between the two cities, I believe. And remember, this was kind of like a conquering army instituting these religious beliefs. So you'll have all sorts of like geographic differences in their culture. Then you get like the big split kind of right off the bat of Sunni and Shia. One was following the uncle and said he's the person who rightfully should lead. The other was, I think, a son or a cousin. So you get this split right away, but you always had these kind of disparate groups that were already split, and they were conquered by the main wave of Islam and made to have the basic tenets, but they all became sort of a sect in themselves just from the geographic differences, and then you have the different sects within that. So it's pretty convoluted, at least according to Wikipedia. And there was I think it was actually in the Near East at least. There were some very advanced Muslim schools, and there was kind of a purging of the scientific schools. At some point, they were seen as anti-Islamic. So even though these areas, their culture might have been brilliant, then you have kind of the main kind of Muslim army sweep through, kind of destroying that, which is unfortunate. Somehow in Christianity, that kind of survived underground, and it popped back up in like the Royal Society, the Masons, etc. These kind of lovers of science. And that didn't happen in the Muslim world because it was just more vicious. It was more brutal. And these people were, their schools were burned down and they were killed. So it's, maybe we would have done the same thing. We just didn't find them. So I wonder what we would do if part of our race, and it really is one race, if part of our race kind of devolved a little bit, and then we're kind of stuck with like very aggressive and low IQ groups. I would think eventually the higher IQ groups and the less aggressive would eventually kind of band together. That's always kind of been our superpower as humans. We were not physically impressive as, early hominids. But, the whole opposable thumb thing, using tools, being able to make tools, being able to make weapons, of course, but also working together and being able to communicate with each other and, being able to kind of form these hunting groups that would take down a mastodon or a giant tiger. Because, one human against one giant tiger, even today, you're pretty much ass out. The only thing that saves us is our tools and our ability to group and to communicate with that group and say, hey, you throw rocks at him from behind and distract him while I shove this spear into his neck, and then you got like a whole squad of guys shoving spears into his neck while he's turned around looking at the guys throwing rocks at his ass. Like that's the kind of cooperation that we have, and that's our advantage. That is really the human advantage. I love how we go into these differences, but we don't go into these kind of freakish similarities. One of them is actually something that feeds the ancient alien people. I love talking about this because I always picture that guy from the Ancient Aliens, that like Greek professor, whose hair looks like it's being pulled up by a tractor beam, like he's slowly being kidnapped by aliens. I always find that funny. Somebody actually did like a little video where you see his hair going up. Funny as shit. Anyway, so we have these ancient alien people who point out that our backs are not really meant to last very long. And that does not say aliens, There's actually a very simple explanation for that. Our backs being able to raise us to, use our peepers to, look across the flat plain and see that tiger's tail sticking out of the grass. That was such an important advantage that we never really evolved a perfect, a lot of the other bipedal species were like the dinosaurs that were bipedal. They had kind of this teeter-totter thing. We never evolved that. We just didn't have time because when we evolved kind of standing up on two legs, it was such an important improvement that it's almost like the universe didn't give a shit how we did it. It didn't care if that, in our 40s or 50s that we'd break down. Half of us would be, dead by that time anyway. It was all about, can you see that tiger? Can you protect your family and your kin from that tiger? And evidently we did, because we're here. So it was a successful adaptation, but at the same time, there was kind of an evolutionary cost to it. So we stand up on two legs pretty much all the time, and we can look across the plain and see that, see these predators coming at us much, much earlier than the other primates who were not, who couldn't stand upright like us. So we got that genetic advantage. And across the board, across the entire human species, our backs break down. It's only a matter of time. Some people may last longer. Some people may not. Some people may have scoliosis. But across the human species, we have this thing in common where our backs suck. They're not really... we paid like a heavy genetic price to be able to see predators from much further away. So it's something we have in common that's much more important than, one group has nappy hair and one group has straight hair. And what we have in common tends to be like the whole opposable thumb thing, although that's, us and the other primates and the proto-primates and the other hominids that existed throughout our time scale. It's still something all humans have in common. Not only opposable thumb, but like a pinky that isn't like way up on your arm or something like that. It actually lets you use tools much more effectively. So there is an actual purpose to the pinky, by the way. So what does this all mean? It kind of means, to me at least, if we're so tightly knit that a little bit of inbreeding can basically destroy whatever group we're in, it means that we basically have this kind of slice. A lot of the so-called races are really just kind of gene pool slices where for whatever reason, a group that broke off only had a certain amount of those genes, and as they went to whatever environment, that further cut it down. So if you get to the point where you're kind of interbreeding with your family, Not so good. You're already kind of too tight knit genetically. And if you have the entirety of the species being represented in this one area, that also lends credence to this kind of tight knit species with very little coming in from other hominids as far as we've seen. I think only Neanderthals are in certain gene groups, like some of their genes are in certain gene groups, but I think it's only 5% of humanity. So 95% of humanity doesn't even have Neanderthal genes. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I watch a lot of these specials, but sometimes I get them mixed up. So race is really just kind of gene pooling. And yeah, it becomes a problem when there's inbreeding, but as long as we don't, we push against that, which most civilizations do, or else they don't survive because they collapse from what comes out through inbreeding, we're all pretty good. There is no like inferior species or, there are no real major differences within the species. It's just that genetic variation from that bottleneck, and that's all we got. And it's kind of a nice thought, Not just because I'm like a liberal Unitarian type, but because I'm a human. And in a way, we kind of need to keep mixing up, because or else we're going to produce tighter and tighter knit slices where we're going to mimic inbreeding, because the person down the street is just too connected to you genetically, and without that genetic variance, all this bad stuff comes out of our gene pool and we die off. So evidently we've been mixing up quite a bit for the last 200,000 years, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be here. If we weren't kind of the hornbag race of hominids, we would have gone the way of the other hominids, and we never would have made it to become the primates, one of the primates. And in our case, the primary primate. So that's all for today. I hope that what I'm saying makes sense, because it's if I explained it correctly, I hope it helps people see that we're not all so different, and that a lot of the differences are kind of minor, but the similarities are oh so fucking profound. Cool. All right, so that's the end of I almost said September. Friday, February 24th. All right, look forward to interacting. Love your comments. Of course, don't ignore bl-kirk 1 on Patreon. You need your cash. All right, so much love. Talk to you next time.